To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of Death Panel and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And of course, to help us out some more, you can always share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, Counting Like a State, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolden, and my guest today is R.H. Lossin. R.H. teaches courses on American history, politics, and art at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. R.H. is also the executive director of the program on law and political economy at Harvard Law School. Her first book, Sabotage, The Rise and Fall of a Revolutionary Idea, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. And I've asked her on the show today to talk about a recent article of hers that was published by the Law and Political Economy Project called Property, Sabotage, and the Origins of Anti-Left Repression. R.H., welcome to the Death Panel. I'm so glad that you could join us today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk through this essay with you. As I mentioned at the top, it was published last month on LPE blog, and it's called Property, Sabotage, and the Origins of Anti-Left Repression. And now, one of the main reasons I wanted to ask you on to talk about this piece today is because upon reading it, I immediately appreciated the way that it takes a very hard look at how political repression actually works. And it does that through this very insightful look at the history of criminal syndicalism laws, the International Workers of the World, or the IWW, and the question of industrial sabotage, not just doing it, but the ideology of it, the political strategy of it, the political education around the tactic of industrial sabotage during the first quarter of the 20th century. Now, the basic history that you run through is that during this period, 21 states and 2 territories eventually passed these criminal syndicalism laws. These were presented as responses to terrorism, political violence, threats to state security, etc. But they were actually really being used to go after the IWW, right? Importantly, this wasn't about criminalizing particular acts of sabotage or property destruction. This was actually aimed at criminalizing the advocacy and the teaching and the theory of sabotage itself, writing about it, teaching it, organizing around it, promoting the political ideas behind it, political education, pamphleting, et cetera. So obviously, this has a lot of relevance to our current moment. And as soon as I read your piece, I knew that the Death Panel community would be so interested to hear you speak on it and speak at length, and also talk about your broader body of research, including your forthcoming book, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about. And I think one of the things that really just comes through in the piece that I want to bring up right here at the top is that what you're asking us to do here with the telling of this history is not the usual way that, the IWW's work and political theorizing around sabotage is usually talked about. It's usually talked about as this kind of unfortunate or immature part of IWW politics that distracted from the quote unquote real work of organizing. And you're arguing that the disruption of production, the challenge to property that's going on, the education around property that's going on is actually part of what made the IWW so politically powerful and threatening to the state in the first place, right? The state understood that the IWW's ideas and its organizing were not separable, that the ability to change how workers understood property and production and their own power was just as much a part of the threat as the threat of, lost future profits from industrial sabotage. And you make this really nice turn into the present, too, where you're connecting that history to other ways of thinking about the sabotage and blocking of critical infrastructure, right? This recurring idea that a protest becomes illegitimate when it starts to threaten property, when it interrupts commerce, when it, results in lost profit or the potential for future lost profit. So this is not just a history of the IWW, it's also a way of really asking ourselves to think hard about why property gets to be the thing that sets the terms for what counts as legitimate political action and sort of what's going on there when we encounter that common sense line. And of course, that felt so especially relevant to all kinds of questions that we talk about on the show, how repression works, how the state decides what constitutes the threat, and how movements can end up internalizing and accepting the idea that they need to be normative, they need to be moderated, they have to prove that they're not disruptive to be taken seriously. And that sort of results in, more left ideology and theory and praxis being framed as extraneous, unstrategic, infantilized, devalued, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to get ahead of myself here. There's so much to get into, but just to start us off at the top really broadly, I think it would be helpful for you to talk about what the overview of the argument is in the piece for folks who haven't read it, and situate it in the research in the book that you've been working on in this kind of bigger picture, because I think it would be helpful to sort of enter this story by talking about why and how you became interested in the history of criminal syndicalism laws, of the IWW, and of sabotage, and sort of how that led you to this perspective and way of thinking about sabotage. As Walker C. Smith says in that 1917 pamphlet that you cite, no analysis of the labor movement is complete where sabotage is not accepted as a weapon. And, I think that that's just, for me, such an important way of thinking through in this moment, why is looking at this history so important?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it makes the most sense to actually start with how I got here. I developed an interest in not Luddites, the actors, but the word Luddite in the early aughts when I was studying to become a librarian. And the reason why the word Luddite was so interesting to me is because it was this moment of really intense, uncritical techno-optimism. And every time you raised any sort of any critical conversation about everything from book digitization to these emerging social networking technologies was met with this accusation of Luddism, you're being a Luddite. And at the time, I think there have been a few books written in the last few years that have actually been about Luddites, and people have in general understand what this word means. But at the time, people literally did not know what they were about. I didn't know what this word meant. And the way that it was used was to indicate that somebody was just sort of backwards looking and against progress and stuffy and probably old, even though I was quite young. And what the word actually referred to was this very well organized movement against the simultaneous sort of system of enclosures and the first industrial revolution, and the complete decimation of these communities that were organized around very different modes of production, and as a result, had very different social relations. And so I was maybe not obviously, but I was immediately interested in the fact that this accusation of being against progress and this accusation of being against technology was actually an accusation of being an anti-capitalist. And so I became really interested in machine wrecking, and this eventually led me to these sabotage pamphlets. This is what I ended up writing my dissertation about. And the sabotage pamphlets were, I guess the IWW is the Industrial Workers of the World. They're a union that is started in 1905. Very much, they're very far left. It was in response to a labor movement that was organized around the skilled trades and was very exclusionary. And in the late 19th century, with the rise of the Second Industrial Revolution, it became very obvious that there was going to be a sort of there was a permanent proletariat, and workers needed to be organized in a different manner. They could no longer organize around a set of skills. They were being rapidly de-skilled. They could no longer depend on sort of withdrawing their knowledge of a production process. They needed to be organized around industry, and workers that were generally ignored by the skilled trades also needed to be organized because more and more workers were outside of the skilled trades. So this is not exactly the first example, but it's an early example of what we've referred to as industrial unionism. And they start to organize, itinerant farm laborers, women in textile factories, all of these groups of people in industries that the American Federation of Labor has been ignoring. And I'm not actually the person that you need to talk to about the history of the IWW. I think Peter Cole's work is a really good place for that. So the IWW is founded. It's initially it's immediately runs into legal trouble. And then in 1912, they start to publish these pamphlets that advocate sabotage. And the first version of it is actually a translation of a pamphlet from France that was written by Émile Pouget in the 1890s. It's translated into English by Arturo Giovannitti. He's awaiting, he's in jail. Because he was accused of he was accused of conspiracy to commit murder, I believe. There was a murder that occurred when he wasn't there and he was in jail for it. And he writes this really interesting introduction to it. And what the sabotage pamphlets do is not just advocate sabotage. They explain what sabotage is. They use sabotage to sort of explain property and capitalism and class conflict and class interest to workers. And one of the things that they do immediately is to distinguish between what they call capitalist sabotage and worker sabotage. Capitalist sabotage is something they say happens all the time, and it results in real harm to people. So an example of capitalist sabotage would be refusing to maintain a mine, and this resulting in a mine collapse, which gets referred to as an accident. Right. And so capitalist sabotage is very much, it's sort of synonymous with what we would call structural violence today. So they make this argument that capitalist sabotage is a sort of withdrawal of certain energies and efficiencies and like a refusal of maintenance and a refusal of basic care. And it's always in the interest of increasing their profits. It's just cheaper to replace workers than it is to keep the mine in proper working order. Mm-hmm. Worker sabotage, on the other hand, is nonviolent. And this is a point they make repeatedly, that it doesn't actually harm anyone. It is broadly defined as anything from a slowdown to machine wrecking. A strike is a form of sabotage. It's anything that actually threatens profits. And in the sort of one of the more like the earthier formulations is you want to hit the boss where it hurts in his pocketbook, right? And so sabotage is anything that threatens profits and therefore threatens property by a withdrawal of worker efficiency. And this, I think, it should be pointed out that this kind of broad definition isn't just a sort of instrumental evasion of responsibility. It actually indicates a far more sophisticated understanding of what property is than the IWW is generally given credit for. They know that it's not just the table, right? They know that it's profits from future tables. Or even arguably control over like how much labor can be extracted from each worker per hour. So they make this argument about that workers are entitled to this type of destruction, because it doesn't harm anyone. In many cases, it actually saves lives because you're improving working conditions or you're engaging in some sort of open mouth sabotage and alerting consumers to the kind of nasty things that their food producers are up to and things like this. So, but it also is not, it's a very different definition of nonviolence than the one we're used to operating with today. There's a differentiation between property destruction and other forms of violence. And they make this really interesting argument. I think it's Giovannitti who says this, that there's a moral injunction against property destruction because morality is actually just a reflection of what we might say is it's just a reflection of class interests. Like morality is the way that you naturalize material interests. So the injunction against property destruction is an expression of bourgeois economic interests. It's an expression of economic interests. And the working classes need to have their own morality. They don't live in the same moral universe. The protection of private property does not reflect their interests. It's in fact entirely counter to their interests. And therefore, property destruction in this particular in a capitalist economy is completely justifiable because they don't benefit from it in any way. They make the point that there's this ideological fight to be won, and that ideological fight cannot be separated from the distribution of material resources and political power. And so they're both about ideas and practice. And so those are the pamphlets that set off this just absolute hysteria in the 1910s that eventually lead to these anti-criminal syndicalism laws that I write about in the article. But the anti-criminal syndicalism laws that are a reaction to these pamphlets and to the IWW in general, they start to pass them in 1917. And they're enabled by a kind of larger culture of Americanism and patriotism and anti-immigrant sentiment, and the U.S. entrance into World War I. And they effectively criminalize membership in the IWW by criminalizing the word sabotage. And they've been treated as a sort of cynical instrumental move, which they certainly were, right? But if you just dismiss them as the most effective way to put anybody who belongs to the IWW in jail, you miss the fact that they do, in fact, criminalize the word sabotage. They criminalize this really rich idea that, as I've hopefully just explained sufficiently, gets at all of these different problems with private property and class relations, and really effectively organizes a lot of radical activity on the part of unorganized workers. And they're similar in many ways to conspiracy laws, but they don't even criminalize intent to commit an action. That's the thing. They're not aimed at actually actually throwing a pitchfork into a thresher. They're not aimed at 6 people hatching an elaborate plan to throw pitchforks in many threshers. They're actually worded in this way that makes it very clear that talking about sabotage, advocating sabotage in any situation, in print, in a meeting, just using the word at all ever, or providing a space in which people discuss that word, is itself criminal. And I think the reason why I think this is really important is because the banning of a word, the banning of an idea that describes worker power as something that is bound up in an ability to destroy property, either materially or otherwise, indicates, one, how important the ability to destroy property actually is in the struggle between workers and employers. But it also is an early and very clear example of a sort of bait and switch that is still very much in operation, which is to say that all radical you can dismiss all sorts of radical activity if you can peg it to the destruction of property. So what ends up happening is that there's a claim that what you're doing is protecting property. That's what the word sabotage, banning the word sabotage apparently is doing, right? You say, well, we're preventing workers from setting the fields on fire, and everybody can get on board with this. But what in fact is happening is that you're banning a discussion of a whole set of ideas about property. You're banning what you called it was a category of understanding. It's a way of understanding property. It's a way of understanding class relations. It's a way of understanding power. And it's a way of understanding worker power in particular.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.